most vulnerable people in Indonesia need things like working rights. They need things like infrastructure in the form of hospitals and schools. They need things like political representation and the capacity for their voices to be heard in creating legislative reform. By taking bribes, short-term, irregular quantities of money that can do nothing to address the structural causes entrenching them in poverty, they trade off their capacity to address those underlying issues. That is an unacceptable trade-off that we would not stand for in this debate. 3 questions. First, why this is an unacceptable trade-off which locks poor people into political disempowerment. Secondly, why it makes the politics of Indonesia worse. And thirdly, why it removes faith in democracy and therefore undermines the capacity for Indonesia's system to provide tangible outcomes. But first, 2 things in setup. The first thing to say in this debate is we can assume government fiat to some extent. It's not an active debate, so we can assume a significant degree of effectiveness insofar as a critical mass of poor people rejecting bribes. It's not a hodgepodge thing. We can assume most people will do so. And the second thing we can say is that we also stand by them not taking bribes for other forms of elections, just as a consistency within this process. So firstly, why this is an unacceptable trade-off that makes it worse for poor people? And the first thing to do is look at the way these bribes are distributed and to say that the benefit they provide is extremely small. The first thing is these bribes are extremely little in terms of the actual quantity of money they provide, and that is because for many Indonesians, they live in destitution and the amount of money that they are willing to take is extremely low, which means that the actual capacity of that money to do anything for you is also significantly low. The second thing to say is that these bribes are very irregular, i.e. they are tied to an election cycle, so is extremely limited in its efficacy in that extent. And the third thing is to say that the most vulnerable Indonesians are unlikely to receive those bribes. People go door knocking, so you can imagine that people that are homeless or people that are mobile are unlikely to receive any of those financial benefits at all, however marginal they are. So it's an extremely small benefit, which means we only need to prove an extremely small amount of harms to prove it's an unacceptable trade-off. But fortunately, there are significant harms as well. So secondly, why this creates political disempowerment for the people of Indonesia. The first thing to say here is
there are 270 million people in Indonesia. About 90 million of them engage in this bribery practice. And that's important, firstly, because it means that these cultures exist anyway, even if the poorest communities stop doing it. But it also means that there is literally no accountability about whether or not you follow through on that bribe, because you cannot track the votes of 90 million people, which means that it is totally capable for people in poor communities to take money and take money from multiple people and vote however they want to, which does not damage their democratic mean. It just gives them money in a time and in a place when they otherwise desperately need it. I'll give you 2 points in this speech. The first is on why there is no obligation to reject this money and it does not hurt poor communities, and secondly on why the Indonesian governments are likely to resort to worse methods that are worse for people and do not give democratic help. I'll deal first with the main contention of the affirmative team, which is that there is a culture of political disempowerment that arises in them, and there is less kind of rights or policy directed towards poor people as a result of this. Firstly, there's unlikely to arise in the counterfactual, and the fact that there are reasons that no other country with large poor communities gets large amounts of capital and policies directed to them, because they are incredibly disenfranchised groups, and it's very hard to target people who are the same and not living in houses and not getting information in easy ways, and all of the same metrics apply, which is why it's unlikely to be helpful in a way. But secondly, I think it is actually useful to engage people in a political process by making them care about it in a very easy way via their back pocket. That saying, voting day, that's the day when money and envelopes arrive and people discuss policies and you make connections to parties and party leaders and members of political systems, and you care about voting in a way when you otherwise don't, that you see yourself as one in nearly 300 million people voting and your vote will never matter. You were told that your vote matters because you are willing to be paid for it by the government, and that is a way to enfranchise millions of people who otherwise have no way to do that. Secondly, in terms of response to their stuff about there's an overall culture of bribery that this reinforces, firstly, as I pointed to in my introduction, that is not solved because it's obviously not as a culture of bribery that exists purely in the poorest areas of Indonesia. It exists at the top, it exists in magistrates, and that is not informed by it happening in the lower levels. The fact that it happens in lower levels is a result of it happening in the higher levels. I think the affirmative got the causality exactly wrong in this debate. But as economies develop, and the way, and the general trajectory that we've seen in many countries across the world is that there is slowly an attack on corruption as countries economically develop and you get a growing middle class who cares, that kind of stuff. The fact that you have cash envelopes for paying people off is the clearest signal of corruption in order to fight against that. Whereas it's very hard to fight against the corruption that is in your judges, in your lawmakers, and that is not seen in the everyday. And that is the easiest way in order to target corruption in that level, to make people care about it by being so obvious to them. But there are, thirdly, incentives to also have policies targeting poorer people in this area. It's like, when you think about it, a bribe is one reason to vote for a party, right? Like, it is not totally coercive, and it's untrue that if there are 9 parties running and 6 are willing to bribe you, that you would definitely still vote for parties who are not bribing you because you care about those policies, particularly because you are still able to take money, and not vote for people that they're telling you to vote for, which is why parties are able to benefit from other parties bribing and you giving policy that people care about, which is why you still get interest in these poor communities, but it is things that they talk about when they are justifying their vote to other people. There is not a culture of justifying it on the nature of a bribe. There is a political discussion and a political discourse that otherwise would not exist when voting day is not a non-event, essentially, which is what the opposition otherwise results in. So that is why that doesn't stand. But importantly, we tell you that the democratic process is otherwise still totally broken. And that means that you are not changing the kinds of policies that are happening for poorer people. You are not fixing democracy in that instance. There are still large cultures of ballot box stuffing, which makes that democratically illegitimate. Violence and coercion and the shutting down of voting booths all happen at the same time as this, which is why this is not like the major problem with Indonesian democracy is paying people. The major problem with all those other things which still exist otherwise, and this is the way to benefit a system that is otherwise going to screw you over, and is perhaps the best form of that corruption, which is why when they're like, you know, all this political disempowerment and corruption is really alienating, the fact that you might go and your voting booth is not open that day and there are people outside telling you to go home is what shuts people out from that, and that's not a problem you're able to fix under their side. But particularly as well because middle class areas are still doing it as well, like overall democracy is not changing in any meaningful way. Large numbers and millions and tens of millions of people are still doing all of these bribes, and the importance of that argument is that they rely on fixing one minor element of a broken democracy as a means of fixing that democracy altogether and enfranchising people, whereas all those other elements still exist. All you are doing is removing the one element of coercion that actually benefits people on the ground. So, secondly, importantly, this bribe taking is perfectly and totally democratic. Like, in all honesty, it is no different to a series of other things politicians do. It is no different to giving people tax rebates. It is no different to giving out welfare. It is no different to encouraging people to vote for you on policies that would be beneficial in all those instances. All politics is dominated by money. The amount of capacity you are to inform people about what you're doing is you spending money to get a vote. And that is essentially, particularly in incipient or growing democracies as Indonesia is analogous to all those other things, particularly because these are not that effective or not that coercive in the first place. Either for the reasons I've already given you, that you cannot directly account from bribe to vote, and that is a series of other ways that complicate from process from A to B, but also because the people bribing aren't be totally sure about who they're bribing, whether or not they're bribing people who would vote for them anyway, in which case that's fine, whether they're bribing people who will not change their vote at all, whether these multiple competing bribes are all happening, which is why there's not really this clear link between bribery and a lack of democracy in that. So, what we then have to care about is that there is an ability to profit off this kind of government corruption, and the claims in the affirmative as well. It's not that large an amount of money. Firstly, it's like, you know, we'll agree it's like $5 or $10 or so, but that is an important amount of money to people who otherwise wouldn't have it. The amount of purchasing power that have in the poorest states in Indonesia means that you do not need to worry about buying food for the next week. You're able to care more about everyday problems, and even if this only happens every 4 years, that is better than it never happening, which is what the affirmative otherwise stands by. And secondly, because it also happens on such a wide scale, it's not like an individual instance of bribe. Poor communities that have 10,000 people living in them, who all get $5 or $10, means a large amount of influx on a community level, and the economic developments that arise in that are actually incredibly significant. It means that you are more able to connect in other instances. You're more able to create goods that you sell elsewhere. So, at the end of that, you have no obligation to reject this money. Democracy is still just as broken, and we should at least allow you to profit off the sole element of broken democracy that benefits you. Second argument is that now Indonesian democracy is likely to resort to far worse methods. And there are now reasons you're likely to do more of the elements of coercion that are less good, right? Like you're more able to be violent, you're more able to be coercive, you're more likely to do ballot box stuffing, either because you have more money that you are not spending currently on bribing everyone, that you can put into paying people to do that. But secondly, because it shifts the realm of what is acceptable of parties doing. That now, if there are 10 parties running, you don't want to be the first party who stops offering bribes and starts offering, the stick element of this. But if no one is offering bribes anymore, then that culture shifts in a really important way, and it no longer seems as absurd to be using violence or using coercion in order to elicit those votes. And that's an incredibly important argument, even if it does not change entirely, and those exist anyway, and maybe they could happen currently, but a culture that encourages them to worsen and become more violent and worsen that democracy without benefiting a single person and being more violent is incredibly detrimental. We should allow people who have been hurt by their government to find some kind of benefit from it, and bribes are exactly that. Proud to oppose.
Start with two pieces of extraneous rebuttal. The first is to the totally non-contentious principle of negative gain. We do not deny that individuals can consider bribes in a kind of theoretical sense in deciding who they vote for, and that might not be different to other choices they make during elections. But if we can prove that considering bribes at all makes your life tangibly worse in ways that the negative team does not ever comprehend, then we do not need to consider that principle argument. So it's totally contingent and totally non-contentious. The second piece of extraneous rebuttal that I have is about their argument about the worst elements of coercion. The first assertion that this argument relies upon is the characterization of Indonesia as this weird, lawless hellhole in which individuals are free to enact violence on whoever they do not. That is not true. Indonesia has a robust democracy that has been one of the most successful in Southeast Asia for the past 30 or 40 years. It has a very functional court system that supervises elections and often implements the very same transparency measures that the negative team decries Indonesia as not having. Like, for instance, overturning election results where there has been evidence of ballot stuffing in previous presidential elections, which is precisely why that is unlikely to eventuate. And the question you just have to ask is this. If it were, presumably, just having people with baseball bats stand outside an electoral booth is way cheaper than bribing every single person that lives in a certain area. If that were effective, why would people not do it already? Probably because, firstly, Indonesians care significantly more about their votes than the negative team gives them credit for, and secondly, the negative team just seems to conceive of Indonesia as this place where people just do not care about kind of political incentives, and politicians are just yeah, whatever, there are people with baseball bats outside the polling booth. That is not true. Democracy has been a fundamental part of Indonesian life for the past few decades. For many people, it is the only system of government that they remember. Many people were born after Suharto was deposed in the 80s. That is the reason why individuals care about this democracy, and measures that act against it will, if they happen at all, be ineffective and only lead to backlash, which is, in the long run, effective for those politicians. Now to the substantive portion of the speech. First question I'll address is what happens to poor people. First question sub-question I'll ask here is about the distribution of bribes. Firstly, they say lots of middle-class people will still take bribes for their votes. That is implausible, and it is implausible that a significant number of middle-class people currently receive bribes for many reasons. Firstly, it is extremely expensive to bribe a significant enough number of people in the middle class to change the outcome of an election, particularly given that many of the political parties that we're talking about in the first place are either dominated by independents, as is the case in local elections, for instance in Jakarta, where Ahok is an independent politician, or they're cash-strapped in the majority of instances. And it would be extremely risky to bribe the middle class, who are significantly more likely to care about things like the transparency of an outcome, in which the culture of bribery is not as pervasive. So you'd be far more likely to be reported for giving them that bribe, which is why it is likely that the 90 million people that they talk about are the 90 million people in the lower classes of Indonesia to whom this debate applies. Secondly, they say the bribe, even if it's small, it's still a significant amount. Well, there's no economic development if the money is just going to buying food for a week. That doesn't really tangibly impact your ability to do more with what you have already. And secondly, we would suggest that that argument is just uncomparative. If their benefit is you get enough $5 so you can buy food for a week, that pales in comparison to the benefits that we prove to you that they do not ever contest, right? Arguments that suggest that the long-term trajectory of taking bribes for poor people is their total political disempowerment and the impossibility of ever getting change. But secondly, the second question I'll ask is what this does to the empowerment of poor people. Firstly, they say this makes poor people care about elections because it says voting day is the day where you get a cash envelope. Firstly, I've already given you reasons to believe that the substantial portion of Indonesians do care about their vote and understand why it matters. You don't need a significant degree of education or wealth to understand that the people in power are the people who determine what schools you get access to, what hospitals you get access to. Secondly, for the reason that it is, secondly, they don't consider the counterfactual, because plausibly it's true that the way to motivate people, politicians use to motivate people to go to the polls now is to give them cash envelopes, but politicians still have an incentive to ensure people turn up to vote, particularly if they give policies that are beneficial to the poor, which is why in the alternative, politicians will still find alternative ways of getting people to polling booths, like saying it's really important that you vote, or saying it's really important for the local hospital, the building of the local hospital, that you elect a certain party into power. Secondly, they say you can just not vote according to the bribes that you receive. I understand that that's probably what they prepped in the prep room. Unfortunately for the negative team, it is totally unresponsive to all of the material that Maddie gives you, because we do not require Indonesians to vote according to which party gives them the biggest bribe. We just require the existence of a culture of bribery in general, because obviously the individuals that get elected into power, or the people with the most political capital, do not observe the way in which poor people vote. So it's sufficient that there's a culture of bribery which makes people distrustful of the poor. The effect of that is threefold. Firstly, people think that Indonesian poor people vote according to the bribes that they are given, which means that politicians have a far lesser incentive to do things like cater policies to poor people. And the reason they can't just be like, well, we noticed that not everyone that we've given a bribe to has voted for us, is that you have very little access to information about what the other party's doing. It's not like you can just ask another political party, hey, how much money did you give to this community in order to bribe them? Maybe they just assume things like, oh, they must have just given this number of people a bigger amount of money. Oh, maybe they gave them the same amount of money and they just made a decision out of a whim. So that lack of information means that even if people do still vote according to their pre-existing interests, parties make the assumption that bribes are what determine votes and not policy. Secondly, people hate poor people. A culture of bribery in Indonesia makes the middle class and the upper classes, the people who are most politically enfranchised, significantly less likely to support policies that help the poor if they see them as the individuals who are undermining the fundamental tenets of Indonesian democracy. And thirdly, it discourages political collectivization on the behalf of the poor, because it makes it significantly more likely that a large number of individuals will fluctuate their votes depending on who they are, who bribes them the most. And note the negative team does not contest that at least a sizable proportion, even if a minority of individuals will change their vote depending on who gives them the most significant amount of money, which means that they are less politically empowered in general because they can't collectivize their votes and ask for things. What is the alternative? We tell you that it's a number of things that you cannot get with bribes. Things like long-term investment in poor communities. Things like infrastructure with $5, even if distributed into a community of thousands, is unlikely to buy you like schools and hospitals. It's things like electoral and legislative reform, like better working rights so that poor people do not have to live on meagre wages. And to that, the only response is like a one-word response in Thomas's speech when he says, well, poor people are currently disenfranchised, but that ignores the reasons that Maddie gives you as to why poor people, but for the existence of a culture of bribery, would be in the interests of the government to cater for, like the fact that they're often concentrated in key areas, like significant proportions of the population in Jakarta would vote overwhelmingly for politicians that support big and more expansive social welfare. Secondly, for the reason that it's good for Indonesia to expand the base of its working class and make them more productive. The problem is politicians currently are focused myopically on getting into power. They perceive the way to power as being to bribe these individuals. In the alternative, they will care for the things that are in the interest in the Indonesian people. Or finally, to preempt, like, oh, man, what if they don't have enough money? Like, obviously, Indonesia receives heaps of development aid. It's like one of the largest economies in Southeast Asia. They probably have enough money to spend. Finally, on democracy, this gives literally like no response from the affirmative negative, but to say that like at least this form of bribery is easy to account for, but it would be still preferable if it didn't exist, you know? And the other thing to say is this creates the very problem of corruption that they want to stamp out in the first place. Firstly, by locking out people from running for politics if they're not corrupt. Secondly, by hugely incentivized corruption by recouping your electoral costs once you're in power by siphoning off funds from the places that you have access to. And thirdly, by making it more difficult to prosecute individuals for corruption because you yourself are likely to have been corrupt, and that can be used to tar you as well. On all those grounds, we clearly win this threat.
The best reason why these bribes do not work to actually meaningfully benefit the populations that receive them is the fact that to this day they have not. And Indonesians have not bought ferries and lifted themselves out of poverty and become this great stable state that side negative relies on in order for their acceptance of the existence of corruption in democracy to be something that they are willing to stand by. We tell you that on our side, if they identify that democracy is flawed, it is wrong to stand by and not attempt to correct it. Whilst we may not be able to prove that there will be a perfect democracy in our world, we mitigate the corruption, we start to move away from that corruption, and that is always going to be a good thing that's in the long run interest of the people of Indonesia. So, firstly, the impacts of bribery on poor people. Firstly, as I've highlighted in my introduction, the bribes are not that beneficial. They're incredibly small. We tell you that they are short-term, that they're sporadic, they come once every 3 to 4 years, and that also they often miss the most vulnerable people in the community, say the homeless, who do not have fixed addresses and do not get door knocked on to bribe. What that means is that even if you are getting a brief injection of funds in like the dawn attack on election day, you do not get any permanent change from this, and we need to be comparative in this debate because in a world where you do not have that mechanism to turn to people to convince, you turn to other mechanisms. We prove that those other mechanisms are more likely to be things that actually engage voters. Pacino concedes this when he says they'll do things like campaign with simple slogans. If they're campaigning with simple slogans, we think that is a net win as opposed to not campaigning at all or campaigning with cash envelopes. But let's get into a bit more detail here. Firstly, they tell you that the politicians are unlikely to ever care about people in this situation. We firstly think if that is true, it is true under both sides, so you don't actually get much marginal change, but it's also just not true because there are a huge amount of people that are poor in Indonesia that form a large majority of people who vote. You do need that numerical amount of people, especially in electorates where people are all poor. Those electorates, you need to cater to the votes of poor people because it's determined based on people who live there. But also, here are a bunch of reasons why things like threatening people and thuggery are not going to be the things that they turn to. Firstly, it is easier to make promises about things that you do than to hire thugs to threaten people with baseball bats. There is no cost to a candidate to promise to do something, even if they can't fulfill that promise. So that's actually probably the first port of call because it's free. But also, they would do things like turn to ads as they concede. And we think that's more likely because things like the stick approach obviously also deter people. They are also illegal. And yes, bribery is illegal, but you're not going to go to complain to a police officer that you were bribed, whereas you will if you were beaten up at the ballot box. So that means that all of their alternate tactics are much less likely to be the things that they turn to. And in fact, given the a kind of anti-corruption stance of a number of candidates, we think it is just simply implausible to say that those people would tacitly accept this violence overcoming the democracy. We think there'd be quite quick crackdowns on that. But also, we think that in terms of when they say that people can't understand policy arguments, you don't need a formal education to want a road built next to your house. You don't have to have gone to school to know that school is good. Just because these people don't have an education doesn't mean they don't have brains. And we think that that means you can still campaign to them on policy grounds. Even if it is simplistic, we think that still means, at worst, you're getting some level of engagement with those poorer people. On our side, the only engagement is via that cash handout. Then, the third claim they have here is that people actually via this cash handout do become enfranchised. It makes them care about voting. Firstly, getting cash on election day doesn't mean you automatically think that elections are good, in the same way that eating chocolate on Easter doesn't mean that you think that Jesus died for your sins. People can associate rewards and disassociate them with the actual events that we're talking about. And secondly, we think that is even more true when the cash undermines the entire value of that democratic system, which says that you should be voting freely and you should be voting based on policy, and have someone that represents your interest to slip it a few dollars under the table obviously goes entirely counter to a democratic system we want. So even if people view democracy positively, they would be viewing a very bad form of democracy positively, and that would not be good for them in their long run interest. So, we think that on our side of the house, you at the very least have an incentive to engage with the mass of voters who you now cannot engage with. You are not going to be violent in the way that you engage them because that will deter them much more than actually just trying to campaign to them. And in campaigning to them, you are at least likely to get some engagement with that voter group that they never get on our side of the house because those people are constantly paid off with money, and that means that those political parties that are campaigning to them don't have an incentive to even try and develop those policies Also, we tell you that that entrenches the negative perception they have of poorer people as just being selfish and caring about money, which makes them as unwilling as well to develop policies to cater to them. It makes the middle class hostile to those. And given that, yes, as they tell you, those are the people that do control the upper echelons of government, it is problematic that they have that view of the poor in their society as being people who are individualistic, selfish, and can be bought with a couple of dollars. So, what that means is that the impact of poor people on rampant bribery is overwhelmingly negative, and it cuts off any chance for policy or any sort of structural development that will meaningfully impact their lives. A couple of dollars on election day was never going to be good enough. So, then secondly, what does it do for the political system overall? Obviously, at no point did we say that it was the giving you a bribe would change the way you voted, but by their own analysis, they've created a system in which you need to give bribes to even get a foot in the door. That is firstly true because candidates, at the very least, knowing that rampant vote buying is widespread, know that if they cannot afford to do that, they will be unlikely to be successful. They will perceive that as true, even if it's not actually factually true. But secondly, it probably is factually true for the analysis that Thomas gives you when trying to make this argument about thugs. And they say, like, if 9 people are giving bribes, you don't want to be the one person that's bashing people up. In the same way, if 9 people are giving bribes, you don't want to be the one person that's not giving any money, and that's definitely going to hurt your electoral chances. So that means that that means that money has a greater degree of influence, and it does things like, for example, stop poor people from running for parliament because they can never afford to face those bribes, even if there are still barriers to their success, even if their democracy is always going to be to some degree entrenched by money. That is not a reason to accept it and encourage it and to let it be further entrenched by money. Finally, not the most important harm, but a very important harm that we give you in this debate, which receives no response, which is that this threatens the overall legitimacy of democracy and increases the perceptions of corruption, which undermines everybody's faith in that system. They tell you that this is actually the best form of corruption because it is the most visible. Obviously, the fact that it is visible but not challenged, like if 90 million people are getting bribes, there is clearly not an antipathy towards that type of corruption. People are not opposed to it, so its visibility isn't exactly helping you target it. It's not being targeted. But also, when it is done like that, it suggests that those tactics are legitimate in the political system, which means things like individual politicians getting paid or getting kickbacks for allowing certain projects to go ahead becomes seen as more legitimate because they're just recuperating the funds that they expended in getting elected. But also, finally, it is true that there is gateway corruption in terms of we think that if you're accepting these small levels of corruption, it does things like incentivize the police force to also be someone who accepts bribes and in exchange for letting you out of jail or not prosecuting you for certain things. And that undermining of the institutional stability is one of the things that development economics overall has proven is the most fundamentally damaging thing to any country's ability to be able to develop strong, stable institutions. By allowing this at the lower level, even if we cannot perfectly correct everything at the upper level, we at least take steps towards it. Side negative does nothing, we propose. Here's where we've got to. There's no reason to think that a bribe leads to a vote, and there's no reason to think that a politician thinks a bribe leads to a vote. So there's no reason to think, besides this retreating to this nebulous idea of a culture of bribery, that a bribe would be sufficient to earn a vote. Which means that, 1, there is no reason why bribery comes at the cost of policy. They've given you no reason why bribery comes at the cost of policy. And conversely, there's no reason why their case leads to good policy. They've never made those links. And for that reason, there is no reason why you would reject this $10. So, first, are the poor politically worse off or better off as a result of bribes? So they suggest that they would otherwise vote for policy, but they haven't proved that that change would happen, and they haven't proved that, that people would vote as a result of the bribe. It has to be this cultural thing that they have relied on. So let's examine this culture of bribery. 5 things to say about this culture of bribery. 1, as they have stated, there is shame around taking bribes in Indonesia as there is a concomitant culture of democracy. For that reason, all of their arguments about seeing the poor as selfish, seeing the poor as bought off, rely on a culture that does not exist and that they have not proven. Most people lie about the fact that they have been bribed. The reality that so many Indonesians take bribes was a shock to everyone and not something that is widely publicized in Indonesia because it is shameful. And so there is no culture of bribery. It is an underground culture, just like like all bribery cultures are. Secondly, the bribe market is not exclusive with convincing people. Imagine this. How much would it cost to convince a communist to vote for the Liberal Party compared to a normal Labour voter? Obviously more, right? Which is why convincing people brings the bribe market down. So even from a perspective of a briber, you would still want to have policy that convinces people. Thirdly, Kevin says they care about their votes. They work so hard on this side to do a characterization of Indonesians as people who care about democracy either way. So there's no reason to think this changes the hearts of poor Indonesians. If it is so true that they care about their votes either way, they are still just as likely to unionize under both sides. Fourthly, politicians still need people to turn up and do those votes the way that they need it. They have no reason given to you why this is mutually exclusive. Given that bribery is not an effective mechanism, they would still do that. Fifthly, it does get you G'd up about your vote. The same way that you might get G'd up and turn up to church if there was going to be chocolate there. Because it is, and it's even better than that, because on Easter you don't choose between a number of gods, but at the election, the ability to choose between a number of bribes means that you might consider which of those bribes you're going to take, which is democratic thinking. So, and the sixth reason why this culture of bribery, and can you believe I've got into six, is the reason the culture of bribery doesn't make sense is because there's no reason given to you why they say that good policy is the result. At Pacino, we tell you that good policy is incredibly costly to the upper class, and that is why it doesn't happen. But also importantly, as they said, the Indonesian people are smart enough that if someone offers you a hospital and you want the hospital, you would vote for the hospital. And they have given you no mechanism why you would not vote for the hospital under either side. So given that they have accepted that the bribes don't work, we can imagine that whichever party offers the most hospitals wins elections currently. So to that extent, they have offered you no change. So what do they say as their last resorts here? They've given you a couple. The first is, well, parties with no money can't compete because they can't get any skin in the game. It's only parties that are willing to bribe that can participate. But we gave you a principle, which is also a practical response about this, which is this is the case in every democracy. If you have no money, you can't do ads. If you have no money, you can't go and pay people to go out and door knock. You can't put up posters. So this is essentially principally not important. So secondly, Pacino shows you how even in their best case of scenarios, they get no help. So he generously engages with, well, what if they do ad campaigns? What if they do scare campaigns? And he characterizes these as not that democratic, not that likely to get good policy outcomes. And considering that they never proved that those would lead to better policy outcomes or they were any less coercive than a bribe, then we have no reason to wish that people would vote on scare campaigns rather than bribes. Scare campaigns leave your wallet empty, and for that reason, we would prefer that you vote on bribes rather than scare campaigns. But even if but the idea that it would just be scare campaigns instead of bribery was hugely generous from us because we give you a number of mechanisms. They make up this baseball bat idea, but never respond to these three words: ballot box stuffing, ballot box stuffing, ballot box stuffing. Ballot box stuffing. Next, they're like, well, everything else the cops will just find you out for, as if cops can't find out about bribery. Why don't cops find out about bribery? The cops are bribed. The same way that cops always don't follow up on assaults when it doesn't matter to them. As we all know, they don't follow up on violence when it doesn't matter to them. They commit violence when it does matter to them. There's no reason to expect that they could, for example, even bribe people not to run in elections at all, because they will have far more money in their pocket to, buy baseball bats, but buy any other method that does not redistribute money to the poor. So the last attempt is, what is the value of a bribe? They say, well, if a bribe was so valuable, why wouldn't you have gotten yourself out of poverty empirically? That's Theo's introduction. Have you ever read one of those economic studies, or considered maybe yourself giving a microloan of $10 to someone in a developing country, and read one of those studies about how $10 can change their life? You might have read one of those studies about how a microloan of $10 can change someone's life. And if you have, you know that a microloan of $10 can change someone's life. And they say, well, it's so irregular. But the opposite of irregular is actually regular, which is what elections are. They're irregular 3 years apart. And the idea that it's not enough, the idea that you can't bribe homeless people because you can't knock on their door, you don't even have to go through a door. And they also still vote in elections. I don't mean to mock homelessness, but it's actually ridiculous that you can't bribe homeless people. So at the end of this, it's clear bribes are money. Lastly, culture of bribery. They then resort to this culture of bribery that would get worse
but they never explain how it will change. And for that reason, all that you can expect is that everyone is getting money from bribes in Indonesia as a result of their policy, except for the people who actually need that money. So let's now analyze this culture of bribery. So, which by now we kind of all accept exists, even though Kevin, he kind of goes out on a limb and is like, everyone's actually nice. So, firstly, we think that it shows that they've blamed poor Indonesians for a problem that this won't fix, and that democracy is still inherently flawed in Indonesia in a way that this would not fix, which essentially means that elections will still be decided by money, but it will just be money going to middle-class people. They suggest that you can't buy middle-class people because it's costly and they might report you, which are all things that could also be true of large portions of poor people. And do not apply to middle class people particularly more. But even if it was true that you can't bribe middle class people because it's costly and they might report you, that suggests there's no huge bribery culture as a result of this. Like the idea that all of the middle class would report you if you tried to bribe them suggests that this isn't a culture that is that endemic. It's something that only the poor benefit from. And this is why this issue of the culture of bribery can't win this debate, because when it's convenient for them, they suggest that all other elements of Indonesian society are free from the culture of bribery, which suggests that it's very unimportant. And then when it is important to them to say that everyone else also get bribed, that shows that it's not that important for the poor people to be the ones that stop. So, importantly, once we have, so that's why the culture of bribery stays the same under their side. It shouldn't be the poor that lose out on that money. Think about what you can buy with $10.
This reply, much like the negative team, will prove that bribes are good and the alternatives are bad. On whether bribes are good, we tell you firstly that there is no existing moral harm to bribery, that it is it's completely analogous to other kinds of money in politics, that you are still able to exercise your democratic right due to a lack of accountability, and that democracy is broken in other ways and this is not a meaningful contributor to that. The contention from the affirmative in response to that material generally is to say that politicians believe in this culture of bribery, which means they are then unlikely to give policy to those areas. I'll deal with later whether or not that policy actually eventuates, but let's deal with the mechanisms along that. We tell you 3 important things. The first is that politicians also know that these bribes are not perfect, and that they know people can still vote for all these other parties regardless of their bribe, which is why Kevin's response to our material doesn't stand up, and it does matter that one bribe can vote for anyone, because politicians know that, and thus, if they have an incentive to give policy, also have an incentive to give policy as well as bribing, which is particularly persuasive when you consider our material that you are more able to bribe someone effectively when you also have policy that is appealing to them, not only because it lowers the cost of that bribe, but because people are more likely to follow where that bribe trajectory is trying to take them. And thirdly, we know that that culture of bribery is not so widely published, is either hidden, as we tell you in Eden's speech, that it is shameful in many instances, or as the affirmative tells you that there is some kind of strong democratic culture that encourages people, even when they're bribed, to care about democracy and care about their vote, which is why there is no moral harm to bribery and it does not bring about their harms. What is then the benefit of it? And despite everything the affirmative tells you, they can diminish this benefit, they can say it is not that large, but they cannot remove it. And at the end of the day, we are giving money to tens of millions of the poorest Indonesians. So, we tell you that even if it's not a large amount of money, it is some dollars that can buy you things that are important, particularly in poorer areas, and that amount of community money escalates over time and inflates when it's injected in overall economies that is important, even if it is not managing to pull Indonesia out of underdevelopment, as Theodora suggested a culture of bribery was. That is why bribes are good. Secondly, why the alternatives are bad. Because both teams agree that in absence of the capacity of mass bribery, there will be incentives to try and get votes in other ways. But the question is then how? The affirmative suggests it would be policy, we suggest it would be either ballot box stuffing, which gets limited response, or there would be inaccurate slogans or coercion. I'll deal quickly with coercion. They suggest, well, that coercion won't happen because it would be reported and it is illegal. We tell you some reasons it would still be able to happen in certain ways because officials are also bribed off. And importantly, to any extent that it happens, it is an enormous harm in this debate, that it is more likely to be violent towards people and more likely to push them away from those democratic norms when they are shut out of that actively. Or secondly, we tell you it would be things like simple slogans that would be far more persuasive and far easier than policy to do. And the response to the affirmative is that simple slogans, isn't that kind of just democracy? But we tell you, firstly, not when those things are scare campaigns, which was the part of the analysis that did not get a response, or two, do not deliver their benefits. Because every time they tell you that you have to compare the amount of money you get to all the infrastructure, if it is simple slogans that mean nothing, that will never be followed through on, they do not get any infrastructure in those poor communities, and their false creation of a comparative that did not exist is shut down when they rely on those simple slogans that they will not follow through on and that mean nothing to people. They then, on policy, suggest they will do good policies for those areas. We suggest that it's incredibly unlikely. Firstly, it's really it's really difficult to disseminate information to people about those policies. It is incredibly costly, far more costly than ballot box stuffing, bribery, or coercion in order to create policy in those areas. And it's far harder to convince people of the merits of that policy than any of the metrics the negatives suggest to you. That's why at any point they suggest you would get better policy, they do not. We are sure that bribes work and are good for people, and that is why the negative is won.
The arc of justice in Indonesia, like in many Southeast Asian countries, bends slowly, but it does bend. Many fledgling democracies experience the issues which Indonesia does. Many of those fledgling democracies do not suffer the same problems of endemic corruption that Indonesia does. So the question you have to ask is this: ought the poor of Indonesia throw their hands up in despair, accept a few dollars every few years, maybe at best the promise of a barge which will break down in a few years because you don't have enough money to maintain it, or ought they take their destinies into their own hands and bargain for something better? Because the trade-off we offer you is the endemic poverty which the negative team consigns these individuals to because they rob them at each and every stage of the political capital that they need to access change, versus a system in which the poor of Indonesia are essentially given the political purchase that they require. And that is a future by the negative team's own utter lack of imagination that they have totally failed to deal with. First question I'll ask in this reply is about corruption, because they never respond to the arguments that we give you about why the poor taking bribes creates a specific culture of corruption within elections that, yes, exists alongside a pre-existing culture of corruption, but makes it significantly worse. There are three reasons, none of which they have responded to. Firstly, it means that politicians need to bribe people in order to get in, and they need to have a significant amount of money, which means that this locks out structurally a large number of individuals from ever entering politics. Secondly, because they have incurred large costs due to having to pay out bribes, they need to siphon money off the projects that they're in charge of once they are in power. Thirdly, it means that it's more difficult to prosecute corruption because every other politician is also corrupt, which means that you face personal sanction if you call out any other politicians. Three reasons Maddie gives you, I give you again, Theo gives you again, never responded to by the affirmative team, the negative team. So even if you buy all of their material about how this does not change the policies that are given to poor people, this does tangibly change the effectiveness of Indonesian democracy in a way that still markedly benefits the poor in the long term. But secondly, on elections, they give you two broad claims. The first is to say you will just default to other methods. Theodora tells you that things like ballot box stuffing are not mutually exclusive to our side. It already happens under the status quo to some extent. It is a different sphere of politics to things like taking out bribes. But secondly, we give you a number of reasons to believe that things like having people at polling booths monitoring votes is difficult to have, because people can report it. You can't have multiple different people with different baseball bats from multiple different parties at the same polling booth, so they have an incentive to call each other out for that type of behaviour, which is why those alternatives are implausible. The second line of argument they give you is that politicians don't know if bribes convince people. The first question we ask you right from first affirmative is why else would they do it if they did not think it was effective? Far more plausible is the characterization I give you in my speech, which is that politicians believe that bribes work to some extent. They do not have perfect information about about how that influences people's votes, but they make assumptions like the reason this person whom I bribed did not vote for me is because someone else must have given them more money, not that the bribes are generally ineffective, which means the harms that we give you from Maddie are still apply. It disincentivises politicians from making policy for the poor, policy that is often politically unpalatable for the reason that people look down upon the politically downtrodden. Secondly, for the reason that it makes people hate the poor. And Eden's the only response comes at Eden with respect to the middle class when they're like, well, like they still have money to do it or whatever. But our claim is just that it's economically inefficient for cash-strapped political parties to engage in that sort of bribery, which is why it's less likely that people in the middle and upper classes engage in that form of corruption, which makes them hate the poor for being responsible for that bribery. Finally, on collectivization, we tell you it's far less likely that individuals will care about the nature of that collectivization, which means they're less likely to hold the people in power to account. Would it lead to good policy outcomes? We give you 2 reasons. Firstly, poor people make up significant voting blocks. Secondly, and they apparently concede that people know that they want hospitals, so that's even better for our side. And secondly, it's good for Indonesia generally for politicians to engage in this policy. Simple slogans might be simple, but once the politicians get into power, they can enact the change which makes them re-elected in the future. That is why we conclusively win this debate.